This is Doug Green, and I'm the publisher of Telecom Reseller, and I'm very pleased to have with us today Keith Buell, who's the General Counsel and Head of Global Public Policy for Numeracle. Keith, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you, Doug.
Well, we're going to be continuing our ongoing podcast series with Numeracle as we discuss the issue of robocalling and what can be done about it, making people aware of what's happening, and the good news that there are many things we can do to mitigate this problem. Today, we're going to be talking about FCC enforcement actions against robocallers, how bad actors are identified, investigated, and penalized. And we're going to be diving into that topic in just a second with Keith. But first, Keith, could you just tell us quickly, what is a Numeracle?
Numeracle is the industry pioneer and leader in identifying legal callers who are trying to communicate with their customers and ensuring that the identities of those callers are transmitted from the caller all the way to the call recipient. We believe that focusing on legal callers and their identities and making sure those calls goes through helps us to then identify the bad actors, the calls that we want to block or label.
So Keith, what would lead the FCC to identify you as a business or caller that needs to be investigated?
The Enforcement Bureau gets information and leads from a variety of sources. One is honeypots that are out there that receive calls, phone numbers, and then those transcriptions of voicemails are sent on, and that can be a subject that leads to the start of an enforcement action. Consumer complaints that the FCC receives, individual complaints. I've sent several possible leads to the industry traceback group for calls that I've received personally. One is actually kind of funny. I used to work for a large wireless carrier in the United States, and I got a call saying, "Hi, we're calling selling health insurance to subscribers to this particular carrier." And I didn't work there anymore, but I thought, that's kind of weird. I don't remember my employer being in the health insurance business. And I kind of played along for a little bit, dug a bit deeper. And then towards the end of the call, I said, "Well, I'm a regulatory lawyer who used to work for this company, and that doesn't sound like anything that we would be doing is selling health insurance. So why don't I call my friends and colleagues who still work in the legal department there, and I'll have them look into this fraud. I've got your phone number. I'll start a trace back against this." And I was laughed at. They didn't believe me that I actually was telling the truth about that. I did start a trace back on that. What happened to it, I'm not quite sure. And that leads me to the kind of the final source is the industry traceback group, where any of these entities can start a traceback that looks to go upstream one hop at a time to find the originating carrier and hopefully ultimately the originating caller.
So are those the types of calling behaviors that can get you into an investigation, trigger an investigation?
I mean, the FCC is looking for complaints about the content. Typically, they focused on things that are true scams, the IRS impersonation scam, other things that are clearly illegal. They haven't done quite as much about things that are just illegal telemarketing. Those cases are harder to prove. A lot of calls are legal if the customer consents to receive them, but illegal if sent without consent. The last few months, the FCC has done a little bit more in this action, going into car extended warranty and other areas where it is a legal product being sold illegally. And those are a large portion of the illegal robocalls that none of us really want to receive.
So maybe you can walk us through this. Like, what actually happens when the FCC takes action against a robocaller?
So the FCC can take action in several ways. It can issue a cease and desist order to the bad actors themselves. Those who are in the business of clearly fraudulent calls probably don't care too much about an FCC cease and desist order. A little more productive and useful is going after the carriers that are working with that company. There was a big one a few months back where a phone burner and ultimately Twilio received cease and desist letters, and based on calls from a phone burner client, MB Realty, that was doing unsavory mortgage practices, and the FCC told Twilio, "Stop these calls or we're yanking you out of the robocall mitigation database," which sounds like a weird administrative process, but the effect of that is downstream providers are not allowed to accept traffic from a company that's been delisted from the robocall mitigation database. So that was Twilio is a huge player in this space. That was probably the biggest action the FCC has actually taken. And the final thing that the FCC does is actually start a investigation and a fine. And that is an extended process that literally takes years. And I can go through the steps on that if you want. The first step is issuing a notice of apparent liability after the investigation. And I've done enforcement work for a variety of telecom carriers. And so I've got a deep background in this. A notice of apparent liability is kind of like an indictment. It's the FCC coming out to you saying, this is what we think you did. You did something wrong. Respond and tell us why we shouldn't fine you. And those are the ones that usually get the headlines. That's the FCC
Right.
issues $200 million fine against XYZ company. But that doesn't mean that's paid. After the NAL goes out, the company has a chance to respond. And ultimately, the FCC then has to issue a forfeiture order, which is a vote of the full commission to say, we don't find your defenses worthy, and we are going to take this to the next step. So the FCC will issue the forfeiture order. Typically, the target will move to reconsider the forfeiture order, which then delays the process even further. Just earlier this month in June, the FCC denied a reconsideration petition for a $225 million forfeiture order.
Wow.
And that does, oh, sorry, Doug.
Oh, I just said wow.
Oh, okay, and that doesn't end the story because the FCC actually can't collect fines on its own. So after there's a forfeiture order, they send it over to the Department of Justice, which then files a collection lawsuit against the target of the forfeiture order. So then that lawsuit proceeds just like any other lawsuit, with the target ultimately able to raise its defenses again, make any appeals, what have you, to ultimately get a judgment. So it's a very long road from a NAL to actually an enforceable order to pay a fine. And we all know a lot of these companies making illegal robocalls are kind of fly-by-night operations without real assets and basically criminal enterprises that are not going to be ready, willing, and able to pay a fine. They might just start up under a new name and keep pumping out the traffic.
So that lengthy appeals process, all that stalling and making one motion after another and so on, it gives a lot of these operators enough time to do what they want to do. It sounds like to me.
Yeah, I don't think that this is an effective way of cracking down on illegal robocallers because they can just redo it under a new name. There was a Wall Street Journal article, I think it's about 3 years old now, where the reporter found out that the FCC had issued some $200 million in robocall fines and only collected a handful of thousands of dollars in actual fines.
Hmm.
I'd be curious to see an update on that article. I don't have any more current data than that, but I suspect that the trend is somewhat continued of massive potential fines in the headline, but very little actually going into the U.S. Treasury.
And so, you've seen this done before. The FCC has done this to parties before.
Yeah, the FCC has been very aggressive on the robocall enforcement front. I think, and I've been saying this for years, ultimately, the way to get these calls stopped is to have originating carriers make the illegal callers persona non grata and just say, we don't want you as a customer. We don't want your traffic. And the illegal robocallers will have to shop around and hopefully not be able to find a carrier willing to take their traffic. And the other thing that I've always thought would be effective is an illegal robocall is a means to an end. It ultimately there's a crime being perpetrated in a lot of these, some sort of fraud, deception, theft under false pretenses. And instead of issuing a fine that's not going to be paid, let's get the people in jail who are actually defrauding people. That's complicated. We often have trouble tracing it back to the actual callers. Often they're located overseas and beyond the jurisdiction of US law enforcement. But I think those are the two steps that are critical for doing this is putting people in jail for the actual fraud and making carriers not want to take their traffic. And we've done a lot recently towards the latter goal of making carriers not want to take their traffic with know your customer policies. And hopefully that will have more effective effect It's kind of a redundant phrase uh, in the near term.
So those are the penalties, they are being enforced.
Yeah, the penalties can be quite high. I mean, thousands of dollars per call. But what's the penalty if you don't have to pay it? So
Right.
yeah, I'd rather see lower penalties and actually collect on them and create that real deterrent value that the penalties are supposed to impose.
So Keith, let's talk about takeaways from our brief podcast today. Is there a quick message or warning you can give service providers seeking to avoid enforcement action from the FCC?
The FCC has done a lot against providers that will never pay. My hunch is that they want to get a big fine against a company that will pay and can pay. And they can get the headline, company XYZ pays $20 million fine, I think is better than company ABC receives $200 million fine and never pays. And there are a lot of carriers out there that are not actively participating in illegal robocalls, but kind of turn a blind eye to traffic
Mm,
across their networks. And the FCC's recently introduced the know your upstream provider requirement that we have to know, carriers have to know who they're exchanging traffic with. And Numeracle has issued a sample guideline for both know your customer and know your upstream provider that gives carriers, voice service providers, the tools they need to know who they're working with and whose traffic they should be refusing. I think that is probably the next focus of FCC enforcement is the carriers that don't have effective policies in place and are turning a blind eye. And while they may not be the ones in cahoots with the bad callers, they're profiting from the calls going across their network.
So, Keith, one of the things I'm taking away from our discussion today is that, whereas the FCC may miss the mark really in being able to enforce the fly by night guys who are just trying to do kind of a hit and run and there's no long term investment for them. Legitimate companies that have a long term investment in our market, that have a reputational stake and have economic stakes and so on, could really be stung if they're not watching what they're doing.
Yeah, my gut tells me the FCC wants to issue a fine that's going to get paid. And thus far, the
Hmm.
big fines haven't been paid. And there are a lot of companies out there that are the middleman in a lot of this traffic, where the good gets mixed in with the bad. They're not trying to get rich off illegal robocalls, but they don't really know what's happening two, three, four hops upstream in the call delivery process. And the good gets mixed with the bad. International gateway providers are especially at risk because we know a lot of these calls originate overseas, and those overseas callers are not familiar with US calling rules and practices. And their illegal calls get mixed in with legal calls coming into the US. And those are legitimate companies with real resources and a stake in the game. And I would think the FCC might be interested in finding them. That's where I think they want to go instead of issuing a fine against a company that just is going to disappear and never pay it.
Well, Keith, that's a very fine handoff to our next podcast, our next session, where we're going to be talking about knowing your customer to protect voice service providers from FCC enforcement actions. Literally, that sounds like that's a really important thing that everyone needs to think about and do. Keith, I want to thank you for this segment of the podcast series that we're doing today. Where can we learn more about Numerical?
Thanks, Doug. The best way to learn more about Numeracle is our website, numeracle.com, where you can download the KYC policy that I mentioned before and learn more about how Numeracle is verifying the identities of legal callers and working to get that information into the hands of call recipients so that when you pick up the phone and it says ABC company is calling, you know for a fact that it really is ABC company calling.
Well, we're going to be talking more about that, knowing your customer issue in our next podcast. But for now, I want to thank you for joining me today.
Thanks, Doug.